Time now for our analysis. You've been watching the first 2024 presidential debate hosted by CNN.
President Biden and former President Trump defending their records in front of the American people. And WGN political analyst Paul Lisnek is still here with us. We've been listening to every word from both of those candidates here. Familiar themes and exchanges. This got a little nasty. Trump needed to appear presidential. Biden needed to appear strong. What were your thoughts?
Well, that's what I said as we went into this. I'll take it the other way. Biden, I said, needed to show the energy and vigor he showed at the State of the Union. He did not do that. I think most people will notice, and the analysts will be there talking about the raspy voice. He had trouble finding himself at one point after the first or second question. He actually lost his train of thought. That's not going to play well when people analyze this. For President Trump, former President Trump, I said he'd be best advised to set out a plan and policy for 2025 and stay away from the gripes. Well, he didn't set much of a plan out. He did not stay away from the gripes, but here's the thing. If he was going to be caught on the gripes talking about the weaponization of the justice system and all that, which, again, as a lawyer, is not what's happened to him. But that was up to President Biden to go after it and to speak up. He just didn't. Either wasn't able to do that or didn't have the skill to do it. But clearly, this is not the Biden that was the Biden we saw perhaps 4 years ago, who was a much stronger debater than I think he was tonight.
Yeah, there was not a lot of rebuttal from Joe Biden.
No, and there was a question we were talking about fact checking. Shouldn't Dana and Jake be fact checking? And the bottom line is, it was determined that they would not be. The determination was, look, if there's fact checking to go on, it needs to be the other candidate. Even with the mics off, they all came back and said, let me pick up. I want to respond to that. But there were so many things from former President Trump saying, I never said that in Charlottesville, which is on tape. I brought insulin down in price. I mean, those things are not true. And we didn't get a response to that from Biden. So, where does the blame go? Do you blame Trump for saying something that isn't true? Do you blame Biden for not responding to it? I think you got to say, you know what, President Biden? You should have gone after him on that.
And I guess you get this in a lot of debates. There was a lot of name calling, right? You're a liar. You're a whiner. Did you get a sense of what either candidate would be able to do in terms of policy decisions? Because they did dwell a lot on the missteps during each of their terms.
Well, I think you got more policy comments from Biden than you did Trump in terms of what he would do. He talked a lot about what we're going to do this and we're going to do that. The name calling and stuff, some of that you feel is part of their rehearsal going into it. Clearly, Biden calling Trump a liar and all that, that was sort of pre-planned as he did it and had some certain lines. The one time they kind of got into it was really towards the end when Trump actually kind of baited Biden a little bit about the golf handicap.
Yeah, that was
and Biden bought into it. No, I do have a good handicap, and Trump's just making a face. Why are we going there? Just acknowledge it as silly and move on back to policy. Nobody wants to hear about that. So there were not many of those kinds of missteps. Lots of insulting. Listen, Trump was asked about going after his political opponents. He didn't deny that he would, and he basically said President Biden is a crook, and and will pay the price. And we didn't get much of a response to that from
the president. Did mention that he's up for a lot of indictments and things like that.
Did?
And he talked about having sex with a porn star is what he said. Listen to how that came out.
I've seen a woman in public for doing a whole range of things, of having sex with a porn star on the night while your wife was pregnant. I mean, what are you talking about? You have the morals of an alley cat.
Give you a minute, sir.
I didn't have sex with a porn star, number one. Number two, that was a case that was started and moved. They moved a high-ranking official, a DA.
Well, first of all, that case wasn't about sex with a porn star. So I understand that. I'm sure President Biden was, prepped to sort of, hey, bring that up, make sure you mention that, because that would be a nice baiting thing for Biden supporters and maybe to shift Trump people in another direction. But the reality of it is, first of all, Trump has and always has denied having sex with Stormy Daniels. That's kind of undeniable at this point, between evidence and other things that we've heard. But the point is, it's not what the case was about. It had to do with fraudulent business records. So I get what Biden was trying to do by making the point. But once Trump said it didn't happen, Biden should have just said, what the bottom line is, you were convicted because of fraudulent records. And how do you have a president of the United States who is committing fraud in the keeping of their business? What does that mean about the records here? Or however he wanted to take it. We didn't go there. It was simply a jab trying to get at the character of an alley cat. That's actually a decent line. Maybe will be remembered, but it wasn't what that case was about at all.
Another line that came up was that notion about suckers and losers, which President Biden attributed to Trump saying about prisoners of war and those killed in action. Let's listen to that exchange.
What's taken place. What's taken place in our country, we're literally an uncivilized country now. He doesn't want it to be. He just doesn't know. He opened the borders. Nobody's ever seen anything like. And we have to get a lot of these people out, or we have to get them out fast because they're going to destroy our country. Just take a look at where they're living. They're living in luxury hotels in New York City and other places. Our veterans are on the street. They're dying because he doesn't care about our veterans. He doesn't care. He doesn't like the military at all.
We have great respect for veterans. My son spent a year in Iraq, living right next to one of those burn pits, came back with stage 4 glioblastoma. I was recently in France for D-Day, and I spoke all about those heroes that died. I went to the World War I cemetery he refused to go to. He was standing with his 4-star general, and he told me, he said, I don't want to go in there because they're a bunch of losers and suckers. My son was not a loser, was not a sucker. You're the sucker. You're the loser.
I think that line also prepared, obviously, for Biden. You could see that coming. And that was a key line that Biden would have to say and a point to make. The problem is Trump denies it, says he had, 16 or 19 people who said he never said it. And at no time did Biden say, this was General John Kelly who said you said that, who was with you. I mean, he's a very respected general and was a chief of staff to the former president. So it comes from a pretty reliable source who did say that happened in a few interviews that he gave. I think, again, the power of what could have been an incredibly impactful accusation just got lost. Look, Trump did a great job of just denying anything he was accused of doing, and he didn't get pushback from Biden in any of those situations.
If you were to say who won this debate, what would you say?
Well, I would end up saying I think Trump wins this debate. When you're looking at it, I think that's what you will probably see in the polls. People, but by the way, there's a phrase: it's not what you say, but how you say it. And what you say is about, I'm going to round the numbers off, 10% and 90% in terms of all other things, such as paralanguage and how you say things. But you know what? Even in that split screen we just saw, when you saw Trump's facial reactions, you didn't have to have the mics on. Everybody thought it would be great that the mics would be off because then Trump can't scream and yell and do that. He didn't need to. His face said it all the way through. If you looked at Biden's face in those very same moments, you oftentimes he would look just with a sort of a half smile on his face. I wasn't quite sure where he was looking. It didn't seem to be at Trump. It was more of a look that wasn't one of determination. So the power of that split screen is to be powerful. And I think the bottom line is, I think when you're going to see who won the debate, I know we have viewers that are on both sides. Biden supporters will say Biden won, and Trump supporters will say Trump won. The bottom line is I try and watch these things as neutrally as I can, and as somebody who's taught communication for many, many years. And I think the bottom line is we're going to see polls will say that debate goes to Trump.
So the mic kill switch was one part that was very different about this debate, but also the fact that there was no live audience, which you think might have helped Trump, but in this situation,
look, those were Biden demanded rules. The mic cut and the no audience, Biden's team wanted that. So the theory is that was going to help Biden. But in the end, no audience, because Trump plays off an audience. Some would argue he needs that audience. But, he didn't have an audience, so he did what he had to do, and he did a pretty good job. He didn't violate the rules. He didn't talk over the microphone. He played by the rules he was set, and a very powerful facial expression. CNN in the feed gave us a double screen many times during that time. As far as the mic off, again, they weren't cut off if they overspoke it. Their mic was only on when it was their time to speak. And that's different, right? Nobody was cut off. They just didn't have the mic on. So they both seemed to abide by that. And Trump really, it was not something that really seemed to benefit Biden at all.
Dana Bash did press Trump, saying, what would you do if the election doesn't go your way? Will you abide by the results? And he got into January 6th. Let's listen to that.
Question was, what do you say to those voters who believe that you violated your constitutional oath through your actions and inaction on January 6, 2021, and worry that you'll do it again?
Well, I didn't say that to anybody. I said peacefully and patriotically. And Nancy Pelosi, if you just watched the news from 2 days ago, on tape to her daughter, who's a documentary filmmaker, they say, but she's saying, oh, no, it's my responsibility. I was responsible for this.
Look, he encouraged those folks to go up on Capitol Hill, number one. I sat in the dining room off the Oval Office. He sat there for 3 hours watching, begging, being begged by his vice president and a number of his colleagues on the Republican side as well to do something, to call for a stop, to end it. Instead, they talked about these people being patriots and great patrons of America. In fact, he says he'll now forgive them for what they've done.
Look, Nancy Pelosi, Trump says Nancy Pelosi refused but we know from enough testimony, whatever, that just didn't happen. That was not true. I've interviewed Chief Stephen Son of the Capitol Police. That did not happen, but there was no pushback on it. And when Trump says, I gave a very powerful speech later on as far as that took hours and hours. If I were Biden, I would have said your own daughter tried to get you to do something about it. You wouldn't. All that's in the record.
Should the moderators have pushed back a little bit, though? I mean, I've done debates before, not presidential debates, but if I know they're saying something that isn't correct or they haven't answered questions, you ask them to come up and do it.
And you do that, and you're tough at that. But here, I think the situation is these two anchors did not want to be accused of being unfair one of the other. And I think, by the way, the analysis of the two of them, even from the Trump side, is going to be they were fair to both of them. They didn't put. And by the way, Dana Bash asked 3 times, "Will you accept the results?" He kept going elsewhere, but ultimately he said, "Sure, if it's fair, I will." Well, what else is he going to say? So no, I think the anchors get actually a positive rating for how they did.
All right, Paul, thank you.